Welcome to Ripple Effects, Travelers with Disabilities Abroad, brought to you by the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange, a project sponsored by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs and administered by Mobility International USA. We know that international exchange can influence personal and professional development. It can enhance one's confidence and skill sets, broaden one's perspective, and shape one's educational path. It can also influence job choices and career opportunities. Let's find out how. For this season of Ripple Effects, we hear the stories of international exchange alumni with disabilities and how their programs relate to their careers. This is part of a new initiative from the Clearinghouse called #LifeAfterExchange. I'm Justin Harford, a project coordinator with Mobility International USA and your host for Ripple Effects. Kenny Fries is an award-winning author and teaches in the MFA in Creative Writing program at Goddard College in Vermont. Having completed 2 Fulbright Scholar programs in Japan and Germany has given him a multicultural basis for exploring issues of disability and modern culture. His latest book, In the Province of the Gods, in which he discusses his experience as a disabled foreigner in Japan, was released in September 2017. Kenny, a lot of people maybe might know about some of your research and writing. And you're a dual Fulbrighter. You did Germany and Japan. I wonder, though, if you could tell us about where your kind of passion and excitement for international exchange first started.
Sure. Probably when I was watching the Olympics when I was a young kid. I became fascinated by the places where the Olympics were held. And actually, when I started to travel, I went to places that held Olympics, especially Winter Olympics. But then I went abroad to study in London and Cambridge for a year as an undergraduate. So that's where I think it really was activated, where it became active.
Could you tell us more about that experience and what was that? What was that like?
Oh, it was incredible. I mean, I was 19 years old and in a place I had never been before, albeit in a place that spoke English, so that made it easy, and it just opened up so many horizons for me. If I point to anything that led me to be a writer, I think it was that year that I spent when I was in London.
Well, so already from a young age, your international exchange was kind of influencing where you were going in life. You said you were at Cambridge?
Yep. I was in London, but the tutor I was studying with was at Cambridge, so I would go up there once a week or so.
You have 2 Fulbrights in Japan. That was quite an experience for you, right? I mean, why don't you tell us about that with your Fulbright in Japan and all of the things that happened, all the professional, personal. There was a pretty eventful time.
Yeah, it sure was. My Fulbright was not the first time that I went to Japan. I first went 3 years earlier as a creative fellow of the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission and the National Endowment for the Arts. So that kind of laid the ground for my returning in 3 years on the Fulbright. Both Fulbrights have been kind of odd because I've had some experience of the country before I got there, so I wasn't hitting the ground. I was hitting the ground running. I didn't. I had things in place before I got there, places to live, connections, that sort of thing. But Japan definitely changed my life. I mean, it led to my book that's coming out in September, In the Province of the Gods. It led to a poem sequence in the Gardens of Japan, which has just been published as a small book of poems. It's also been a song cycle that I worked with the singer Mika Kimula on this for many years. And it also led to my being commissioned to write the libretto for an opera by the Houston Grand Opera, the opera The Memory Stone, which was premiered in 2013. So for a decade, my work was really centered on Japan, and it's all because I went abroad to live there. It wouldn't have happened any other way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I was reading in one interview that you gave a while back. I think it was for a German publication. They were talking about how a lot of your writing is kind of like in the memoir style, and yet then you're talking about here. You did some pieces that sound like they were kind of a larger and covering a more broad base. And I'm kind of curious if you could sort of describe overall, since that time, kind of what has guided your writing style. How you describe your writing style?
Well, I mean, I actually started out as a playwright. My graduate degree is in theater, and then I published poems. And while I had an agent as a poet, don't ask how that happened. It's rare and kind of ridiculous. But yeah, my agent was trying to sell a book of poems, and an editor wrote back and then asked if I wanted to turn the material into a memoir. So that's what I did. And I started to basically write nonfiction. I mean, though the works are memoir based, they encompass much things larger than just my life. My book before this one was the history of my shoes and the evolution of Darwin's theory, where I look at Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace and the theory of natural selection, how it relates to disability, using my shoes as a metaphor for adaptation and variation. And similarly, though In the Province of the Guards might be my most personal book, it really is a look at how a different culture looks at mortality and death. And so that's so though I use my own story as the basis, my work does branch out into other things. My current book that I'm working on now, Stumbling Over History, here in Berlin, where I live, looks at disability in Germany, both past and present, with an emphasis on the history of what happened during the Nazi era with Action T4 and the killing of disabled people. So yeah, so I use my life, but that's the narrative device, but the work always encompasses something way larger than that.
Like disability, like larger disability questions of life and death and disability.
Yeah, I mean, most of my work is centered around disability in the body or my intersecting identities as being gay, Jewish, and disabled. Yeah, so that's most of our focus is on that.
It sounds like, though, kind of going from your experience in Japan to Germany, you kind of had a different experience of disability, and maybe that kind of might have influenced the different direction that now your writing is taking.
Well, I think the difference is basically I mean, though most disability history is still uncovered and not talked about and not widely known. I think the history of disability in Japan is especially hidden. Whereas in Germany, though it's still hidden and not as known, it's more public. And
there's like certain aspects are more public, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, there's no history of the state killing disabled people in Japan. So that's a very big difference. And also the way people deal with difference in Japan is more, I would say, subtle than it is in Germany. So in Japan, my experience was basically people treated me strangely because I was a foreigner, because I was basically Caucasian, and not because I was disabled. Now, this is not to say that Japanese with disabilities or other people that have other disabilities than I have would be treated that way, but that's the way I was treated. And so here in Germany, it's different. I'm a new wheelchair user. I've only been using a wheelchair since 2009 when I dislocated my right kneecap. And Berlin is pretty much the first city where I've used the wheelchair more than I have other places. So I notice more invisibility, more staring here in Germany than I did in Japan, which is surprising. Because in a lot of Asian culture, especially Chinese culture, I found that being disabled was a constant visual issue. The staring, people follow me, that sort of thing. So there is a difference because I didn't experience much of that in Japan.
And it sounds like kind of. I wonder if you could share with us. You mentioned that it sounds like your international exchange had quite a lot of influence on kind of the direction that you've taken with your careers. And I wanted to know I wonder if you could offer any other reflections on kind of how your times abroad have influenced your work as a writer and researcher, and I think you also teach as well.
Yeah. I do teach. I it's I mean it's always I've learned a lot. I mean, the one thing I've abroad is that certain things I take for granted in the way of looking at disability in the United States doesn't translate to being abroad. For example, in Japan, it's a very homogenous culture. And in the US, when I talk about disability, I make references to African Americans. I always say, like, the whole idea of separate but equal, and you wouldn't let this day and age, hopefully not, relegate African Americans to using the back door, where disabled people always do. In Japan, that doesn't register at all. And I realized that pretty quickly.
There's not as many opportunities to compare like that.
Yeah, there are cultures that are as diverse as the United States. But what I figured out in Japan pretty quickly was that because it's such an elderly society, one of the most elder societies in the world, I was able to make that comparison. And to use, access and stuff, what's good for disabled people is good for the elderly, that sort of thing. So I learned that, the things that the way I look at disability in the States it's contextual, which goes back to my Darwin research, because we think of the survival of the fittest as just the survival of the fittest, but that's not the correct phrase. The full phrase is survival of the fittest in a particular environment. And so, and it's also a phrase that Darwin didn't coin. So it was coined by somebody else, and he didn't use it until much later in the third edition of On the Origin of Species. So it's really a contextual thing. And it took my time in Japan to really cement that for me. And that's something I wouldn't have gotten by just, staying at home.
I think that's so important, especially for your work and for the larger projects that so many of us have as far as promoting international development, disability rights around the world. Sometimes we can approach it like one size fits all by accident. Nobody does it on purpose. But sometimes we overlook other kind of maybe more unique opportunities, like the Japanese respect for elders.
Yeah, the other thing is that also what happened in Japan was interesting, is that I somehow got involved in things I never thought of before. There was a conference I was invited to on international development and disability. And that's something I would have never thought of, and it was only because I was invited to give a talk there while I was in Japan that I was able to learn about the issues about international development, how they affect disabled people, and I would have never have known that. In a word, indispensable. I mean, the being abroad has just been indispensable to so many aspects of my life.
Awesome. In the Province of the Gods is out now, and thank you so much for your time, Kenny.
Okay, thanks, Justin.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes and consider sharing us with your networks. Also, let us know what you think at Twitter @MobilityINTL or Facebook Mobility International USA using the hashtag LifeAfterExchange. For up-to-date information on the Fulbright program, contact the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at eca.state.gov. And to learn more about hashtag LifeAfterExchange, go to miusa.org.